Now it came about in those days that Moses went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. And when he saw there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian.
The scriptures indicate that 40 years before the Exodus, Moses fled from Pharaoh by traveling east to Midian, an ancient territory located entirely in what is now Saudi Arabia.
If Moses were fleeing from incarceration in Egypt for murdering an Egyptian, then this would be an ideal place to find refuge. It is outside of the control and influence of Egypt.
Moses' decision to hide in Midian may have been influenced by the presence of the Egyptian military in the Sinai Peninsula. "3,500 years ago, Pharaoh's soldiers supervised the construction and operation of copper and turquoise mines throughout the southern Sinai. Inscriptions on their walls and the surrounding ruins of ancient temples still provide graphic evidence of Egypt's presence here during the years of Moses' exile. It is doubtful that, as a fugitive, Moses would have lived or traveled anywhere in the South Sinai with an army committed to his capture close at hand. The prospects of sanctuary in Midian, however, were far greater. Separated by the Red Sea from the Egyptian army in the Sinai Peninsula, Moses married a Midianite woman, tended the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro, and lived in obscurity for 40 years, until the day he wandered to the base of Mount Sinai. There, God spoke through a burning bush and revealed his plan to free Israel from bondage. Given the biblical record, some believe that Mount Sinai must be in Midian. But is there any other evidence to support this theory? Several Jewish documents, some written 600 years before Christian traditions, locate the Mountain of God in Midianite territory. In 250 BC, a council of 70 scholars translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek for the first time. Their translation of the Exodus account presupposed that Mount Sinai stood in the Arabian Peninsula. 3 centuries later, the Jewish philosopher Philo placed the mountain east of the Sinai Peninsula and south of Palestine. At the same time, the Apostle Paul, who was educated under the Rabbi Gamaliel, also located Mount Sinai in Arabia.
So Paul and Philo, when they use the word Arabia, they're not thinking of the Sinai Peninsula. Once again, I think that point needs to be emphasized very clearly. The terminology Arabia in the first century, Greek geographers usually have in mind the Arabian Peninsula. That's how that term is used.
Perhaps the most specific description of Mount Sinai's location can be traced to the first-century historian Josephus, who wrote, "It was the highest of mountains, near the city of Midian." Shortly after this account, Midian was identified in the Arabian Peninsula by the Greek geographer Ptolemy. And 1900 years later, archaeologists excavated this city that, according to ancient records, had once stood near Mount Sinai. The ruins of Midian lie just outside the modern-day town of Al-Bad, near Saudi Arabia's northwest coast.
Josephus and Other texts seem to be fairly clear in Jewish tradition in locating Mount Sinai somewhere in the region of the city of Midian. So the notion that Mount Sinai is not in the Sinai Peninsula is something that many scholars have argued for years. And the notion that Sinai should be placed in northwest Arabia specifically, I would say probably in continental scholarship, in other words, German and French scholars, it might even be safe to say it's the dominant idea.
I think there's an increasing opinion that Mount Sinai is to be found in northwestern Arabia.